The year is 750 AD. You have just walked through the gates of the largest city on the entire planet. Not Rome, not Constantinople, not Baghdad. A city of over 1 million people, laid out in a perfect grid, sealed behind walls 30 feet high, where the streets are patrolled by drums that tell an entire civilization exactly when to wake up and when to go to sleep. Persian merchants haggle over silk. A poet drinks himself into a fit of genius that will still be quoted 15 centuries from now. Camel bells echo through a marketplace that smells of cumin, incense, and horse sweat. This is Chang'an, capital of Tang Dynasty China. This is the real Golden Age, not the legend painted centuries later, the city itself, exactly as it stood. To understand how Chang'an became this powerful, you have to go back one generation. China had just survived a nightmare. The Sui dynasty, obsessed with canals and conquest, collapsed under its own ambition, drowning in rebellion and debt after barely 4 decades in power. In 618, a general named Li Yuan seized the wreckage and founded a new dynasty, Tang. His son, Emperor Taizong, is the one who actually built the empire, expanding the borders deep into Central Asia, reforming the government from top to bottom, and turning Chang'an from a battered provincial capital into the most carefully planned city the world has ever seen. By the time we reach the reign of Emperor Xuanzang, roughly a century later, Tang China is not just powerful, it is the undisputed superpower of the known world, and every neighboring kingdom knows it. Chang'an is not a city that grew organically. It was designed on paper in advance before a single brick was laid. A near-perfect rectangle, nearly 6 miles wide, divided into 108 walled wards, each one gated and closed at night. 2 massive marketplaces anchor the city, the East Market for luxury goods and Chinese elites, and the West Market where the real spectacle happens. Camel caravans arriving straight off the Silk Road, unloading spices, glass, silver, and gemstones from 3 continents. At night, drums sound across the city, and every ward gate slams shut. Anyone caught in the street after curfew without an official permit can be beaten on the spot. This is not a lawless boomtown. It is the most tightly administered city on Earth, run with the precision of a machine. And yet, somehow, it never stops feeling alive. Let's talk about scale for a second. At its peak, Chang'an is home to somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people living inside the walls alone, with several 100,000 more scattered through the surrounding suburbs. To put that in perspective, no city in Europe will match this size again until London does over 1,000 years later. The walled city itself covers roughly 30 square miles, genuinely one of the largest urban footprints ever built before the Industrial Age, laid out with more precision than most modern subdivisions. Life inside those walls is organized almost like a collection of self-contained villages. Each of the 108 wards functions like its own small neighborhood, with its own gates, its own temple, its own community watch, and often its own dominant trade or guild. Families here aren't just individuals, they're part of clan networks, trade guilds, and religious congregations that stretch across generations, a dense, overlapping web of obligation and belonging. And Chang'an didn't start this way. In the early decades of the dynasty, it's little more than a rebuilt provincial capital. The government has to actively recruit merchants, artisans, and wealthy families, practically bribing them just to fill the wards. By the time we reach 750 AD, that recruitment drive has worked spectacularly. What was once a half-empty administrative capital has become the most populous city on the planet. Compare that to China today. Modern Chang'an, built on roughly the same patch of land, is home to over 12 million people, and it isn't even in China's top 10 cities. Shanghai, Chongqing, and Beijing each hold over 20 million. By today's standards, Chang'an would be a mid-sized Chinese city. In the 8th century, it was, without argument or competition, the largest city that had ever existed on Earth. Walk down any street in Chang'an and the wealth gap is impossible to miss.
At the bottom, a single-room mud brick home, thatched roof, one shared fire pit, an entire family sleeping on a raised straw platform. One street over, a modest merchant's house, tiled roof, a small enclosed courtyard, simple wooden furniture, maybe a servant or two. And behind a high garden wall, a noble family's compound unfolds across multiple courtyards, lacquered furniture, silk cushions, painted screens, a private garden with its own pond. 3 classes, 3 completely different versions of Chang'an, all packed behind the very same city walls.
Behind the walls and the curfews, ordinary life in Chang'an is surprisingly rich. Tea culture is spreading fast through every level of society, and Tang scholars begin turning it from a rustic drink into a genuine art form, one that will define Chinese culture for the next 1,000 years. Street food stalls sell noodles, dumplings, and grilled meat late into the evening before curfew. Persian-style flatbread, imported grape wine, and exotic fruit carried in from the Silk Road show up on the tables of anyone wealthy enough to afford them. Public bathhouses, board games, and traveling storytellers fill the ward streets. Even sport reflects the empire's global reach. Polo, imported from Persia by way of Central Asia, becomes a genuine obsession among Tang aristocrats, played on horseback in front of the palace itself, with emperors themselves sometimes joining the match. And unlike in many other ancient civilizations, women in Tang China can own property, initiate divorce, and even reach the very top of politics. A woman named Zetian did exactly that a generation earlier, ruling as China's only female emperor in her own right. Tang court women, more broadly, are known for riding horses, playing polo, and wearing fashions imported straight from the Silk Road.
A century earlier, right at the start of the dynasty, one story captures the Tang appetite for knowledge better than any other. A Buddhist monk named Xuanzang, not to be confused with the later emperor Xuanzang, whose name merely sounds similar, defied an imperial travel ban and slipped out of China alone to walk the Silk Road all the way to India. He spent over a decade studying at the great Buddhist monasteries of the Indian subcontinent, then returned to Chang'an with hundreds of sacred texts loaded onto pack horses. Instead of punishing him for leaving illegally, the court welcomed him as a hero. The emperor funded a translation bureau, and a towering brick pagoda, the big Wild Goose Pagoda, was built specifically to house the scriptures he brought home. Centuries later, his journey would inspire one of the most famous novels in Chinese literature, Journey to the West. This is a civilization that treats the pursuit of knowledge as worth breaking the law for.
Rising above the northeastern corner of the city sits the Daming Palace, the physical seat of all this power. Built on raised ground so it towers over the rest of Chang'an, its main ceremonial hall, the Hanyuan Hall, stands on a stone platform high enough that visitors climb dozens of steps just to reach the entrance, flanked by twin towers connected to the main structure by covered walkways. From this platform, on state occasions, the emperor looks down on thousands of officials, foreign ambassadors, and soldiers assembled in the courtyard below, an arrangement designed so that every single person in that crowd understands their place in the hierarchy before a single word is spoken. It is, quite simply, one of the largest and most technically ambitious palace complexes built anywhere in the medieval world. At the center of it all sits Emperor Xuanzang, a ruler obsessed with music, dance, and poetry. His court sponsors the Hanlin Academy, a kind of royal think tank for the empire's greatest scholars and artists. Dancers trained in styles imported from Sogdiana perform a dizzying spinning routine at court banquets, while musicians play instruments carried in along the same trade routes as the silk and the spices. And this era produces 2 of the most celebrated poets in Chinese history. Li Bai, a wandering, wine-soaked genius who writes about the moon, the mountains, and mortality, and Du Fu, whose sharper, more grounded verses will later be called the conscience of Chinese poetry.
Their work is still memorized by school children across China today, 13 centuries later. This is a civilization that treats a well-turned poem as seriously as a military victory.
Getting into that court is not simply a matter of noble blood. Tang China runs one of the first large-scale meritocratic systems on Earth, the Imperial examination. Young men from across the empire, in theory regardless of family wealth, spend years studying classical literature, law, and statecraft before sitting brutal multi-day exams that can make or break an entire family's future. Pass, and a farmer's son can end up advising the emperor himself. It is not a perfect system. Wealthy families still have every advantage: tutors, connections, time to study that a peasant family simply cannot afford. But the idea itself, that government positions should be earned through knowledge rather than simply inherited through blood, is genuinely radical for the 8th century, and most of the world will not catch up for another 1,000 years. Walk through the West Market on any given afternoon, and you could believe you are standing at the crossroads of the entire world. Sogdian traders from Central Asia haggle in broken Chinese over bolts of silk. Persian merchants sell silverware and colored glass. Traders from as far as India and Southeast Asia unload pepper, sandalwood, and pearls. Japanese envoys, sent specifically to study Tang law, architecture, and government so they can copy it back home, walk the same streets as Korean students and Indian Buddhist monks carrying scripture. Arab traders representing a new religion called Islam, barely a century old, are already reaching China's doorstep. Chang'an is home to functioning Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian Christian churches, and Manichaean shrines, all operating openly alongside the empire's dominant Buddhist and Taoist temples. No other capital city on Earth in this century tolerates this much religious and ethnic diversity within its own walls, and the government taxes it all happily.
Those Japanese envoys are not simply tourists. Over the course of the 7th and 8th centuries, Japan sends more than a dozen official missions to Tang China, packing ships with scholars, monks, and officials whose entire job is to absorb as much of Chang'an as possible and carry it home. They study Tang law codes and copy them into Japan's own legal system. They study Tang Buddhism and bring entire schools of it back across the sea. And when Japan builds its own new capital cities, first at Nara, later at Kyoto, its architects lay them out as smaller mirror images of Chang'an itself. The same grid of streets, the same north-south axis leading to the palace. An entire foreign nation looks at this city and decides it is the blueprint for civilization itself.
This is also a golden age of raw invention, one that unfolds across the whole span of the dynasty. Woodblock printing takes hold during these centuries, eventually allowing Buddhist scripture and calendars to be mass-produced for the first time in human history, hundreds of years before printing reaches Europe. Tang alchemists, hunting obsessively for an elixir of immortality, spend their careers experimenting with sulfur and saltpeter, work that will eventually lead, almost by accident, to the invention of gunpowder. And later in the dynasty, merchants tired of hauling heavy strings of bronze coins across an empire this size begin depositing their money with trusted agents and carrying paper receipts instead, a system that becomes known as flying cash, the direct ancestor of paper currency, centuries before anyone in Europe thinks to try it. Paper itself, invented centuries earlier, is now cheap enough that ordinary bureaucrats can fill entire libraries with it.
In 750 AD, none of this looks fragile. The treasury is full. The poets are writing their best work. The emperor is infatuated with his favorite consort, Yang Guifei, and increasingly disinterested in the machinery of running an empire this large. He has handed enormous military power to a frontier general of Sogdian and Turkic descent named Lushan, a man he trusts completely, treating him almost like an adopted son at court. That trust is about to become the most expensive mistake in Chinese history. In just 5 years, in 755, Lushan will turn his armies against the very throne that armed him, plunging China into one of the deadliest civil wars ever recorded. Entire regions will be depopulated. Tang census records, which once counted over 50 million subjects across the empire, will show a catastrophic collapse in the decades that follow, as the government loses control of vast stretches of territory. The emperor himself will abandon Chang'an and flee toward Sichuan in disgrace, and on the road, at a relay station called Ma Wei, his own mutinous soldiers will refuse to march another step until Yang Guifei is dead. The emperor will have no choice but to let it happen. Chang'an, the largest city on Earth, will fall to rebel forces not long after, and it will never fully recover its former glory.
But in this moment, none of that has happened yet. Right now, Chang'an is simply the center of the world. A city that proved a government could run on merit instead of bloodline, that religions could coexist instead of colliding, and that a well-written poem could outlive an empire. Even after the rebellion, after the fires and the famines and the fractured provinces, the culture forged in these decades never really dies. Poems by Li Bai and Du Fu survived the collapse of the very court that celebrated them. Buddhist texts translated at the Big Wild Goose Pagoda are still read today. Every time modern China looks back at what made it a civilization worth being proud of, it looks back to this exact city in this exact century. The Tang Dynasty will eventually fracture. Chang'an will eventually crumble into the dust of central China. But the idea of China as a genuine cultural superpower, an idea that still shapes how the country sees itself today, that idea was built right here, brick by brick, poem by poem.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Today we stepped behind the towering walls of Chang'an to witness a city that proved how poetry, trade, and sheer ambition could build the greatest metropolis of the medieval world. If you enjoyed exploring the Golden Age with me, be sure to check out the other historical deep dives on this channel. Please leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments which era we should travel to next. Until then, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next one.